Just as a follow-up question, you came to the Netherlands as the ambassador shortly after the MH17 disaster, or whatever you want to call it. I think there could be stronger wordings, but I won't use them necessarily. Had taken place. So you came to the Netherlands in the middle of the Netherlands talking about Russia. What are your impressions of the way the political spectrum speaks about Russia in the Netherlands? Are you surprised? Are you in agreement?
To be honest with you, I think there was kind of underestimation of Russia itself. Not only here in the Netherlands, but in the West in general. If something is far away physically, for example, in a far distance, it doesn't necessarily mean it's really far. So the good evidence, what's happened with MH17, is clearly saying that this world is shrinking and becoming more small. And mostly the Eurasian continent is becoming very small. The distance is not playing a big deal now in security. Another thing is that, well, yes, MH17 I think changed many things in understanding of Western people.
We have a member of European Parliament. Kati, what was your major observation from watching the documentary just now?
Well, I think over the years you have seen, we have all heard about certain aspects which were here in the documentary, but especially putting them in a sequence, in a 40-minute documentary after one another, that of course all together, that creates a much more dark picture than if you hear about the individual events. I think that was one of the added values of having such a documentary.
And anything in particular that struck you as new or insightful?
And I think for me it confirmed again, you cannot hide that actually it's also Putin himself who created part of the structure. It's not just a matter of what was there and he is just one of the figures of a informal structure ruling the country. No, he is definitely at the head of that chain.
The thought which struck me was that because over the years I've lived in Russia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, I met many Russians pro-Putin, against Putin, that, well, really, these people deserve so much better than this type of system. And then also the question immediately comes up, when is this system going to break? Because it's also clear that this cannot really go on forever. I think a mistake which we made in the West, also in the Netherlands, that for many years we still stuck to the idea that Russians and the Russian politicians would eventually, they want to become more like us. That they wanted this transition to succeed. Later on, when Medvedev was there, that they wanted modernization to succeed. Now, it has led to completely nothing.
They're questioning whether that was actually their intention all along.
Yeah, and maybe Karen Novish, although she documents it very well, she was overly pessimistic. Maybe there were some in the Russian system who really wanted this modernization to work. Well, maybe not in a Western way, but to diversify the economy and maybe for it to have another type of more open system. But, well, maybe it was intended by a number of people from the start to become like this kind of hybrid kleptocratic system. And a number of people, of course, in Russia believe that because of the propaganda, which works very well, and which really surprises me, because I know people also from the older generation, and during the Soviet times they knew exactly how to read between the lines, what in the Pravda was true or not true, and now they seem to be buying this state television propaganda just like it's God's own worth or something like that.
An expert on Russia, but also in international relations. So, kind of the same question: how do you feel the Dutch foreign policy towards Russia has developed over the past couple of years? Because, of course, we've seen many news articles, many responses from different politicians. Could you explain what we are doing and whether you approve of it?
I think in our bilateral relations, the most important part over the years has been economic business relations. And I think that is of course still there, especially in the energy sector. If you see how many Russian oil and oil products go through the harbour of Rotterdam, then you know immediately why Holland would not be the very first one to say, okay, let's come up with ideas like an oil boycott. But I think MH17 changed a lot. That then it became clear to people that first of all, this war in Ukraine was not something which is is going on far away.
Yeah, exactly.
And in a country of which we know little, and so well, it doesn't care for us. But now it really drove the message home, and even those business people who, for their own personal reasons, of course, were always very pro developing this relationship with Russia. Even they then simply knew that they had to shut up. And only then it became possible to move, also in the European context, to very tough economic and financial sanctions. So it took MH17 to go to that point.
What kind of emotion does it invoke just watching the documentary in full once more?
For me, it's still, the fact that Putin might be, maybe he isn't, but according to this film, he might be one of the most, the richest, the wealthiest people in the world. That is pretty impressive for a politician, right? And when you think about it in more international relations sphere, then you also arrive at his influences in international politics. For example, the influences in the European politics. And when you think about the links to Le Pen's party and sponsoring Le Pen's party, or links to the UK nationalists, and basically knowing that he has the capacity to influence anything actually with this money, you also have to reflect about what kind of consequences this can have. And maybe on that, these consequences, for me the impressive metaphor from this film is that Putin cornered the rat and he noticed that the rat will jump back. I think there are actually also phrasals like that in each language. I think in Dutch, if I'm not mistaken, it's a cat that when it's cornered, it will, right? I think this is very telling, because if he really behaves like that when he's cornered, we actually cannot predict his actions when we try to corner him. So then you think also for the second time about the sanctions and what they could mean, or actually perhaps choosing specific sanctions, so economic sanctions versus military sanctions, because you cannot really predict the outcome when he is cornered. I did study in that country, and I did not study only in Moscow, but also in Far East, let's say, in Irkutsk, in Siberia. Of course, this is all a drastic story of how power corrupts and how power can be used for corruption, right? For me, what is very striking at the moment is that the propaganda works so well. Already still in 2008, we had the same lady, Ellen Mickiewicz, that I noticed that researches Russian media already for many, many years, saying that she's actually quite optimistic because Russians sense what the propaganda is. Russians can tell the difference. Russians can be critical. And I am not sure whether they are not losing it very important right now. I think when you think about Europe nowadays, this is versus Russia or versus even the US, this is a kind of a difference of approach towards international relations. The US and Russia and also many other countries, they still think in terms of hard power. And this is so-called realist idea. It's not that it's not real, it's real. But it causes several problems. For example, very often Russia uses this argument that, well, the West goes into their sphere of influence. Me coming from post-communist Europe, now already a member of the EU, Poland, I know that thinking in terms of sphere of influence of Russia is very dangerous, because there are also people in these countries. So we have to think about these countries in between, not only about Russia versus the US, Russia versus the EU, but also what these countries actually want. And I think probably you would agree with me that we have to also look at what Georgia wants, what Georgian people want when it comes to international relations, and not let Russia or a fear of Russia being humiliated, as they presented, to rule the international relations. I think this is something that we have to think about better, how to solve that, because we have to include these countries in between as well, some way, and not only think about them as Russia's sphere of influence.
Okay. Putin has robbed Russia, but that the West drove the getaway car. So that was a reaction from New York Times investigator, who implied that this enormous robbery, this kleptocracy in Russia had only been possible because of the help of our Western oligarchs. So how do you see this relation? Because for me it's a problem not so much of Russia as of globalization and of the problems of all financial structure being globalized, and that actually nobody is in control and that everybody is being robbed at the moment. We're at the moment in a crisis caused by our own oligarchs from ABN AMRO, Goldman Sachs, London City.
We can stick to the link with Russia, but I think it's a very clear point.
For me the question is,
the joint
how far
responsibility.
does our own responsibility in the West go for this problem?
Yeah, I think you are quite right that when Russia was developing, or the Russian elite was developing its own business relations with the West, with Western countries, and well, partly this already started, I think, during the late Soviet days, as Karen Davisha points out. There was a part of the capital of the Communist Party was stashed abroad in the late Soviet times, and that was later more or less appropriated by people like Putin. So they used that, and of course Western companies, well, look at Schröder, he was here, Western politicians, Western, let's say Western oligarchs, Western banks, I mean, they all facilitated what Russia has been doing in the energy sphere and with other income. A lot of Russian money is fled the country, also during the past few years. Now Putin has offered a kind of amnesty, but I don't think that a lot of people will trust them unless he can force them, because they also have assets in Russia itself. But a lot of this Russian money has simply been going around and also going through the Amsterdam Zuidas. I mean, the Netherlands is in Russian statistics designated as one of the main investors. When I looked at those figures, that's not only Shell and Unilever and companies like that, but there's a lot of money, including Russian money, simply going through post-block firms in Amsterdam Zuidas and then being reinvested into Russia. And I think a lot of more investigation into where this money really comes from and who owns it would offer some other startling insights.
I should like to ask a question about the role and influence of the oligarchs. When the sanctions started, it was stated in our press that as soon as the oligarchs would feel that they were hurt economically, they would put pressure on Putin to change or to say goodbye.
For the role of the oligarchs, which was the last question, could you elaborate a bit more on that? And then I'm also going to look over there and see if there's any additions to the answers that we heard.
Yeah, I think the idea of the sanctions, specifically the financial and economic sanctions, was also to change Russia's behavior, to really hurt a number of the oligarchs who are also closely around President Putin. I think those sanctions have been hurting also on, let's say, a Russian oil company like Rosneft. They cannot, for recapitalization, for paying their debts, they cannot go to Western financial markets anymore, which means that they have to be compensated from Russian funds. And basically that's happening. I mean, Putin is loyal there to his close friends and allies. So he has been compensating them also out of funds which should also be used for paying the pensions. Now you can't go on with that forever. And I think that the reason why the sanctions really hit hard was because of the combined effect with the low oil price. Low oil price was also mentioned in Karen Davisha's excellent documentary, and the documentary was also mentioned by her. And that is what really hurts. Well, does it change Russia's behavior? No, not immediately, partly because the close friends to Putin are compensated in another way, and Putin thinking within a few years' time he can ride it out, and Europe may become divided against all those sanctions. He may play with his Greek friends, and then somehow new sanctions or an overhaul of sanctions in the future will be blocked. So he thinks he can simply, okay, people will suffer, he can blame the West so that people will not blame him, and in a few years' time everything will be better. But basically what he was saying as well, I think in his Q&A the end of last week, that oh, this only takes a short while, just a few years, and then everything will get better again. My big question is always, well, what when people start realizing after those 2 years that things are not getting better? So then he will get into some nasty political problem. But his immediate friends, because those are the friends, partly those are the friends from his KGB days, people with the security background who all by themselves now also became like oligarchs.
I will go for one question which been asked, that how the oligarchs in Russia are affected by,
Sure.
by these sanctions. I think that not only oligarchs but the usual people are also affected in Russia, but they are affected in different ways. For example, usual people, they have different interests. Oligarchs, they have different, absolutely different interests. So the effect is different for everybody. The ruble is down, the shops are empty, and they are facing quite a big economical collapse. But the freedom of the oligarchs are also affected, so they are not able to travel in Europe as they love very much to give them the education of their children in Europe and to buy expensive clothes in European shops. So they are also affected. But I think that the sanctions are quite long-running process, and they will, of course, have their fruits, but it will not give us the fruits as soon as we are expecting. This is a long-running process, and I think one day the people also and the oligarchs, they are also already are realizing that this is not fault of the West, but it's a fault of Putin's ruling and the way how he's governing the country. So I think that oligarchs are simply now hostages in Putin's hands. And what we've seen in the documentary, that when the oligarchs were gathered and when Putin was talking to them, everybody knows that it was the meeting for to take them as hostages. Who didn't obey it, they appeared. Some of them died, some of them ended in prison, and so on.
Are you talking to your Greek colleagues, like what's going on? How are you reading this this recent movement by Greece and Russia?
Let me first say that it's not only Greece. So that's where actually the problem starts. It's getting more and more countries, to be honest. It's Hungary, we knew, there was an official visit the first time actually since we had a sanction regime towards Russia, that Russia, Lavrov and another 4 ministers were welcomed in Budapest not so long ago, like a month, 6 weeks ago. We have Cyprus hosting military bases. Now I think the only EU country that will participate in the military parade in Russia. Shocking, really shocking. We have Greece. We have seen their movements. We had some statements coming from Slovakia and from some. We do still have a united position as EU, and I think that's also the only thing that makes us a credible actor in this matter. But we also see how difficult it is to remain united. And well, so far, the EU speaks with one voice, and I very much hope that it will continue to do so. But of course, that's the weakness of European foreign policy. You need 28 in order to agree, but you only need 1 in order not to have a joint position. And this is, of course, something that Putin is very well aware of. He doesn't need to talk to 28 member states. He only needs to convince one leader from the EU member states to come up with a veto. Well, I think in general, also one of the issues that the gentleman asked about moving into Russian territory. I very much agree with what the co-speaker here said, that this is, of course, not how we perceive it. It's also not how we think in Europe in the spheres of influence. However, I have to say, when we clearly see that in Russia, whether we believe it's true or not, I strongly believe it's not true, and I also think that the countries, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, all the countries which are now nor member of the EU, nor, of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a part in any way of Russia, there is this strong perception in Russia. And thanks to, of course, also all what we saw, not a really open media environment, this is something that is also strongly something that citizens in Russia believe, that there is a threat. NATO is still there in order to be against Russia. So this feeling, whether it's based on facts or not, it's there. And therewith it becomes a fact in itself, which we have to deal with. So when at a certain moment, I really hope that we will be sitting down at the table again with the Russians, because we need to discuss security in Europe. We cannot continue in the long way, the way we continue now. And that means we will have to find a way with Russia that they don't see it as a threat.
This Putin or no Putin, Russia can best be ruled in an autocratic manner is meant as a provocative statement, but if you look at the history, which was also mentioned, for 500 years, Russia has had very strong centralized powers in its days when it was most relevant. Actually, because this is kind of a provocation also to you as the audience to think about this, maybe we can have one or two responses and people in the audience who would like to share their opinion on this. Do you agree?
It is a large country, but when it's going to be split up, maybe there is no need for an autocratic government anymore.
So you suggest split up the country. But so I would like to challenge you back then. As the moderator, I would also, because this already happened, of course. Soviet Union was split up in many countries, and yet still we have Putin.
But Russia is still a large country, so it could be split up.
Even further?
Even further, yes.
Okay.
Split up is always dangerous. And then what if we split up, we take Tatarstan out? It's still surrounded by Russia. What's with their security? So there are all kinds of problems connected to split up, and the Balkans are probably one of the best examples to look for how much conflict there can appear.
I had one answer to this statement, and I have a new one. The old one was that there is a democratic tradition in Russia. We have had the revolutions of 1905, the first of 1917. There has been a democratic tradition on the in the rural side with all local initiatives. So when it comes to democratic attitudes in Russia, they are here just as in Europe. And I think there's another argument, an interesting argument Montesquieu had. He said, it's such a big country because the lines of communication are so long, you need an autocratic ruler. But the lines of communication are no longer that long because we have the internet. So I say there are the mentality and technology possibilities for democracy in Russia.
So you have faith in democratizing, even without it falling apart completely?
I don't say I have faith, I only say it's a possibility.
I'm asking for your opinion, right?
Okay, just a few comments. I think, yes, Russia has another political culture, and also the way people look at their leaders and what they expect or don't expect from their leaders and what they want to do themselves is different. And it has something to do with transition and history, and the tradition and history. But I find the statement as it's too deterministic, as if some people have it in their genes to become democratic and others, their DNA is only fit for autocrats. I don't believe that. And you see changes in Russian society, as you have seen changes in the past. I mean, in the past we also had something like when people came back after Napoleon from Paris and they became the décabrists. They came back with kind of ideas that their own country could also be ruled in another way, and they wanted to adapt more of a Western model or foreign model. And well, why could this not happen? Again, people being able now to travel much more, to surf the internet, and coming back with other ideas, not necessarily copies of the Western model. I think we are too often stuck to the idea that for Russia to become a democracy, it would have to be just like us. But you can have more democratic elements into a Russian political culture. And I think I also read the book which you pointed out by Ellen Mikiewicz, when she was doing this focus groups with Russian students, basically with the post-Putin generation, because these people will be taking over later. And they're not exactly full-blown Democrats like you have here, but I mean, they are developing their own opinions. And so I think there is more hope for Russia than you would think at first sight.
Actually, the other statement deals with the term the clash of civilizations. I think it was coined in the 80s, late 80s or 90s by Huntington. And end of history is Fukuyama, I think that's what you are referring to. But is it then maybe not the DNA of the people, but more the way in history it's been brought into the culture, and the culture is what surrounds us that we're not even aware of, but it still influences a lot. You can of course also come back to the previous statement, but I wanted to add this as we've already pretty much established that it's not the nature, but maybe it's more. So please take both statements into account.
I think it changed, and we clearly see that the type of ideology Putin has been developing over the years is a clear threat to our security, to our way of living in Europe. And that's also one of the reasons why we have to react. It's not just what's happening in Ukraine, it's our concept of democracy, rule of law, where he has a completely different idea and value system. And organizations where both Russia and countries like the Netherlands are both members of, like the OSCE, we now see that this ideology is put into practice. And that all the agreements we have made already from Soviet Union times, 40 years ago, the Helsinki Accords, are no longer being respected. So for me, yes, I see it much more as a clash of various concepts, actually, of democracy.
Coming from Georgia, you have had that transition from one of the side of the clash to the other, to be more liberal current day. How would you read the way Russia is run, but also how the West responds to it from the second statement's perspective?
I would say that it's worth to start from the history of Russia itself. Russia has a great history, the great culture which they created for centuries. They create art, music, everything is very good in Russia. People are very good itself, and I have nothing against Russian people. The problem is the government which creates this problem. And I think that Russians, they do not deserve this kind of government, because the people, I think, who most of were affected and suffered from the ruling of Putin are Russian people, first of all. And I think they do not deserve this. Another thing is that let's go again to the history and let's look what's happened with the Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union? This was a union created by force, by invasion of the countries, with a wrong ideology. It worked for 70 years. And I think in 50s or 60s or 70s or even beginning of 80s, nobody could think that it was possible to break down the Soviet Union, but it happened. How it happened? With the small, let's say, virus which came in, and during the Gorbachev it was possible for people to think about the democracy. I was coming from that country which was the part of the Soviet Union, and I remember this time. At that time, I know how the propaganda is working, and how people can be affected by propaganda. And when we saw the polls, which been shown in your presentation, when the Putin's popularity is coming up and down. Well, it's propaganda. Propaganda is a very strong tool, which Putin is using strongly in his country. I think that, as I mentioned, it's my idea that Putin is based on the, let's say, military vertical, and he created this system. Whoever can become the president of America, I think America will not become the autocratic country because of the system which has been created in America, for example.
There recently people have put some side notes in that.
Or maybe European countries as well. I don't think that whoever can become the in charge of any country, they have the risk of to become the autocratic country. I think in Russia it will be very difficult to change the course which they have. They have this course. They decided to have this course, and I don't think they want to change it. I mean the government, but people is something different, which I said they are affected very much with the propaganda.
A lot of corruption in Georgia, and also that are still difficult to get a better economical position, and still people are very poor. Maybe I've missed something, so I don't want to offend you, but...
We had this kind of situation, even I remember this kind of situation of corruption, but the figures which I'm telling you is not even invented by myself. These are World Bank figures, and if you can travel to Georgia and if you see what's happening in Georgia, there is no place where you can give bribe, for example, bribe. Or when I'm in my country, I'm not closing my car. Well, I'm not locking my car at night. Yeah, it can sound a little bit strange, but it really so. We have a really very long progress.
A small response. Yes?
Yes,
I'm doing now for more than 10 years exchange with students from Eastern Europe and Russia. All the time Russian students want to stay in Holland because it's so nice and so flat and all the biking, but alright, every time they go home again. But I don't think that we make the fault that it looks like a fairy tale. Yes, there is hope, but we does not put our way of democratic way with our history in the West put on the Russian system. It can never be. If you see in Russia, in Petersburg, in the Czech Republic, if you see how Stalin will be remembered, we cannot throw away. They had to live with it. And I've been in St. Petersburg in the political museum, and also it has given away, and there is told about the victims and the Gulag archipelago, everything. So there will be small openness there also. I was surprised in the last month. So I think every country will get the government it deserves. And it's not our democratic way, Joseph said it also, it's one of the best, but it's not the, we must not put our dream on Russia.
First of all, we agree that we should not import our model to other countries. I think that's something that the US perhaps for a while thought that that's an effective policy, and we all know it's not. But for instance, what we saw on Maidan, or what we saw with the revolution by now more than 10 years ago in Georgia, where the people stand up and the people say we don't accept by our corrupt leaders what's happening, then the question is, of course, should we look away and say, well, there's simply no democracy, so you cannot elect a democratic leader, or should we, when the people themselves, or when a government, like in the case of Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine, asks, they want to develop further towards a European model, should we then say, no, that's not something we want to assist? So there's a difference there for me. I think, yes, we shouldn't export or oppose our model, but when there are loud voices, either from the people there or from the government, then we can assist. And there are limits. For me, there are also red lines. When we see a country is suppressing its people, it's putting dissidents into jail, we also have obligation from our values to actually raise up and say something about it. Making laws is much easier than changing people's minds. And that's why I think we also have a role to play. Much more tough, more long-term process, many years. But for instance, in the country where I was born, anti-Semitism, anti-Gypsyism, how they look at gypsies, it didn't change because of laws of anti-discrimination. It needs a much broader approach. And there, I think also within the EU, we still have a lot to do.
The discussion is the international community is not helping the average Russian by isolating Putin and implementing sanctions. I would like to hear a response from the, maybe we'll start with you, Tony, because from the international perspective, this is of course not a weird thing to think about, because sanctions are always have two sides of the same coin. So what would you observe in this particular case?
Well, the sanctions, as decided upon by European Union, are very clearly aimed at a number of institutions, persons involved in either the annexation of Crimea or in destabilizing eastern Ukraine. So they're not aimed at the Russian people at large. The point is, of course, that in an indirect way, because of also the way Russia reacts and actually, is in a process of self-isolation, and they're really looking for enemies and setting up the West and US as enemies. That you have to get your message across to Russian people, and that's a very difficult one. And I know also European Union is trying to do that. But it's of course very difficult to counter Russian propaganda efforts. That this is because of the policies of President Putin, and that I was talking last summer in St. Petersburg to some nationalist demonstrators, some elderly people. Basically, they were actually quite nice, and I could speak with them in Russian. And they blamed the West for that they could not get Dutch cheese and our nice big cauliflowers anymore. And I said, well, sorry, but this is your president in your government which is coming up with such sanctions against the West.
But do they see that as the...
It's very difficult to convince them, because they see it's one big plot. Everyone's plotting against them, and they don't see a difference between the US and the European Union in that respect. So this, if the president is telling them that this was all caused by the West, it should be like that.
But also, they are the people who are not buying cheese and cauliflowers, where their president, who the sanctions are aimed at, is still sitting on 80 billion in assets.
Yeah, so we should try and get that message more across to the average Russian people.
Okay, well, I guess that's where it all comes together.
And I think also things like going on with exchanges with students, with the post-Putin generation, because change will have to come from them and not from us, basically. And I think altering our visa policy. I think the sooner people, especially these young people, can freely travel to the European Union, the better. And they can look around and make up their minds by themselves. Because now, I mean, except for the people who are on the visa sanctions list, most of these other people either have diplomatic passports or have Schengen visa long-term already from one of the other countries. So they are already traveling around. Even some of these crooks you don't want to have here. So we have an enormous regime of visa restrictions. And why restricting? I think the people who are most hurt by this are these young people who want to travel and make up their own mind by seeing other examples.
We have sanctions, but we also see it's not always good for the average Russian person. Is that part of the thinking process before being for or against these sanctions? How did you process that?
From all the instruments that are available, I mean, this whether you like the instrument or not, this is one of the instruments which was most easy also to to agree on with 28 countries. And it's not in order to crumble the Russian economy, in order to make sure that Russian people themselves are getting on the streets, but it's just actually to get one man at the table. And I very much agree also with the visa policy, and although Konstantine knows I'm pretty critical about the former government in Georgia, the President Saakashvili, but he did one thing very smartly. After 2008, of course, there was also strong propaganda in Russia against Georgians. And what he did is have no visa policy. So normal Russian people all came to Batumi, to the Black Sea, in order to have holidays there and to see that these Georgians are not criminals or are not violent towards Russian people. And in the end, it's this type of smart policy which can be a type of counter-narrative to this propaganda going on.
So, just the dark side, so the shadow, that's what this documentary is about, Putin's long shadow. And what the documentary illustrates is the long shadow behind him, but what we also see is the shadow of Russia around Russia. And we wanted to have as a final statement that long-lasting NATO debate. In order to escape the shadow, we should let, and in this case Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia as examples, join the NATO. I would like to also invite the ambassador of Moldova, if you would like to share your thoughts on maybe what we've heard so far. You don't have to respond strictly about this, because we're very happy that you're here and we're interested in your thoughts. Would you like to share your thoughts?
My name is Emilian Linic, ambassador of Moldova. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm very glad to be here. Of course, the issue of NATO is not the major issue that Moldova is considering today, but nevertheless, this issue was one of the key issues during the discussions, including discussions under the reforms of the constitutional order in Moldova, because the constitution of Moldova doesn't allow us to join any military alliance like NATO. And this is a problem that we don't have a majority political support and also the support from the people in order to join any alliances, military alliances, so Moldova remain neutral. But it is not the case for Ukraine and Georgia, and you know already that Ukraine and Georgia is a different story. Ukraine and Georgia, let's say they have green light for NATO steps. Moldova doesn't have, but does it mean that Moldova doesn't have the issues that will make the people of Moldova think about security, own security? Because Moldova is under threat. Moldova is a country where the Russian troops are based. We know them, so it's not like in Ukraine. It's not the case like in other countries, but we know that there are troops, Russian troops, based in Moldova without any legal base. So they don't have any legal base to station in Moldova. So up to 2,000 troops and munitions, all equipment remained from Soviet Union, brought from Poland, brought from Czechoslovakia at that time. They were stockpiled in Moldova, still in Moldova, protected by the Russian troops that are also threats not only to Moldova but also to Ukraine. And I speak about the Transnistrian region because those troops are based in that region. NATO is an issue that is a threat to Russia, so the discussions about NATO and Moldova is a threat to Russia. It is a threat to Russian politicians when we start to speak about NATO, and when we open something connected to NATO, for example, an information center in Moldova, the Russian mass media gets it like a big threat to Russian interests. This is the first step of Moldova to become a member of NATO. So these discussions and the NATO issues. So let's say that NATO is a way of escaping from some external threats to a small country. Because Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine is a big country, but it's also small in terms of security. It has a big border. Ukraine has a big border with Russia. Becoming a NATO member is a big threat to Ukraine as well, and maybe bigger than Moldova, because Moldova is just an island. We are not we're a landlocked country. We have only two neighbors, Romania and Ukraine. We don't have any possibility, so from the point of view of military, even as a NATO base or as a Russian base, as we already have. It's not an interesting point, so Moldova is not is not in the way to consider it becoming a member of NATO or another alliance, if we speak about Russia, Kazakhstan and Belarus at this stage.
Make a comment as a former Dutch ambassador to Ukraine.
Welcome.
NATO has recently not so much been on the agenda, I think, in Kiev. What was much more important and much more urgent was, of course, EU membership and how to acquire that, to make what steps in that direction. And I think that certainly the ambassador of Moldova has eloquently explained that it is not an issue there. For Georgia, I think the situation was a little different because of the situation, of course, in 2008. But when you address the issue of EU membership, then I think we immediately get into the connection with Russia, because European Union member states have often presented the case of Ukrainian EU membership as a lesson for Russia, in the sense that if we were able to make a success of Ukrainian EU integration, then of course it will be more difficult for Mr. Putin and his government to defend any longer the autocratic system that he has installed in his country. At the same time, it has also, of course, another side, and that is that if Ukraine becomes a success in terms of EU membership, then it is also a threat, in a way, to Mr. Putin. And then you get into that last remark in the film that we saw, and that is what is a red in the corner going to do. And therefore I think that we have to pursue the sanctions when we see that things are being done that cannot be accepted in the interest of keeping alive, let's say, the political and legal system as we have installed that after the war, and certainly in Helsinki. But at the same time, we have to embark on some sort of dialogue with Russia to get them at the table again. One last remark is that it seems to me that it is very, very difficult to discuss these matters with the Russians when there is a situation that the Russians seem to believe their own propaganda more than the reality.
And so there is a clear Russian aim of preventing the countries from entering NATO. On the other hand, there is still an open door policy, and of course now some people say, okay, we can fix this if we come up with a kind of Yalta 2 and give kind of second-hand type of indirect guarantees to these countries and let them be neutral and all that. Well, indeed, the Budapest Memorandum was rightly mentioned. I mean, these kind of paper guarantees for countries do not really work. And especially not with the present Russian government. I mean, they already broke a lot of rules. Are they going to stick to any rules which we sign with them now? So I think that that the European Union should be much closer involved, also in the context of the new Eastern Partnership, with security sector reforms in the countries concerned, which would partly also bolster security in Ukraine, but also maybe in Georgia and in Moldova, and that the EU should become more closely involved also in helping to solve this protracted conflicts as a security guarantor, as a security provider. And this is still a long way to go, because the European Union is still hopelessly divided on this. But okay, now since we are going to think about a new form of Eastern Partnership, I think this is the right moment to start with such type of discussions. And we also have discussions now about European Army and what it should do, what it should be for. So this is, I think, the right time also to raise those questions. And I see this much more short term than this type of NATO membership in 10, 20, 30 years.
Of course, where it comes from, also when I visited your country very often, I have many friends living in Georgia, and they tell me, look, what is the EU going to do if the tanks are coming? And you see what Russian policy is like, and you come up with these answers of association agreement and all this, we need to talk to the Russians. So yeah, when you're confronted with that, it's very difficult to give a reply which gives this feeling of security also to citizens in those countries which are not only under theoretical threat, but we've seen that they are under a real threat. But how do we address this security question? I think not at this stage by having debates about NATO membership for these countries. This would only actually escalate the very serious situation we are in now. But we need to discuss security. And I'm still of those politicians, still a small majority, who doesn't want to accept yet that there is a new Cold War and we just deal with Russia the way we did during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Not because I see other types of actions, but I really still hope that we can find a dialogue with Russia to talk about the security. To talk about the security also of Georgian citizens, of all the citizens who are not living in countries in Europe who are member of NATO. So for me, it's also, again, something which is very easy to say, much more difficult to accomplish is the biggest security that can be given to these countries is democratic countries where you see that citizens don't want to leave, which we saw for many years, also many young people frustrated in these countries who saw no other future than leaving. I think the biggest success for these countries if their own young people want to stay there because they see a future. And that means a prosperous, democratic country, and that's where I see an obligation of the EU to help. Again, not by saying now that EU membership is on the table, but also not by saying it will never be on the table. At this moment, first other steps will have to be taken. They're part of the association agreement, and I also believe it's our obligation to help these countries to actually achieve all the goals they have set for themselves for the coming years.
However, aggression against Georgia started not because of NATO, but right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in '91, it started in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and also in Acharya, which we luckily solved. But it started in '91. Then nobody was talking about NATO, but the roots are coming from there. Now what I want to say that the conflicts in Georgia or Moldova or Ukraine or even in Azerbaijan, Armenia is not the conflicts which are desired by those countries. But these conflicts are provoked by Russia, who doesn't want to see Europe in the neighborhood, who doesn't want to see the NATO in the neighborhood. And what is the reason? Why doesn't Russia want to see Europe and NATO in the neighborhood? Because he is afraid of NATO and Europe. Why he is afraid of Europe, for example, and why the NATO is important for Georgia. NATO is not only an umbrella or safeguard from Russian aggression. This is also the development of the country, the values of the country, which you have to accept and which you have to develop. You have to develop the democratic institutions. This is, I think, more scary for Russia rather than the troops or military bases of NATO in Georgia. Why? If Russians will see the success story of Georgia becoming the democratic country with a uncorrupted country, it will be a bad example for Russian people and for Putin. That's what he is scared of. He doesn't want to see development in his neighborhood. Whatever those countries, I mean Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, is doing is that we are trying to develop democracy in our country. We want to be an uncorrupted country. We want to be safe country, and safe not only for our neighboring countries, but for the world. As I said, the dimensions of the territory is shrinking because of technologies, and it is very important, and it might be very expensive for the West to maintain the democracy in those countries. But if they will fail, it will be a failure of Europe and on the West, and it will cost West much more expensive price in future, because I think the developed countries are much safer for everybody. The facts are collected very well, and the contemporary history of the Russia and the development of the Putin's life is shown very well. For me, it just came up for me that I think there are some circumstances, and many circumstances, which created Putin. So Putin has been created by circumstances. Many of them, maybe his life, his childhood, his education, but after he's been on this position, I think then Putin started creating circumstances. And then he created circumstances around him. Well, it's obvious, and I think there's no doubt that Putin created system in Russia which is based on the solid military vertical, and well, the country is in a deep corruption, in a big trouble, I can say. This is the fact, and I think nobody will doubt about this. So it's been shown very well in the film, and I really appreciate that I saw this movie.
Thank you.